the rendition of the theme song in this, I do have to remark, it's the way that it sounds, when the reverb in it a little bit. It sounds a lot less like a friendly Laurel and Hardy theme than like a song that you would hear in like a haunted clown house.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Magic Morning Wood. Ron Scott is still incapacitated, so we have another guest host. It's old friend of the show, Geno Cuddy. Hello, Jenny. How are you?
Doing well, sir. How are you?
Not bad, not bad. Glad to see you. Nice to see you again.
Good to be here. I'm glad to be back on the program.
So, yes, so I lied. I said that we would be covering a couple of Pashto films, but that turned out not to be the case. So tell us, Geno, what in fact are we doing on today's show?
I just want to say the initial plan was to cover a couple of Pashto Pakistani films from the 90s, but unfortunately, given my schedule and given the length of both films, I wasn't able to get a watch in on time. So instead, I asked Clive, there's this other film that I don't think has been actually very widely discussed, even though stars two arguably of the most important comedy stars of all time. And the film that I requested and the film that we're going to be discussing tonight is the 1950 swan song of popular comedy duo Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. The film is Atoll K, otherwise known as Utopia and Robinson Crusoe Land.
Right. And I was quite pleased when you chose this, actually, because I'll ask you in a minute what your history is with this film. But for me, this was one that had always been on my list of things I should get around to seeing, because it sounded kind of interesting. And I'm always interested in much maligned films and to see how they actually stack up, to their reputation. But I, for whatever reason, never got around to it. And this was perfect timing because recently the BFI have put out a Blu-ray, right, which looks pretty good. So how about you, Geno? Was this something that you had seen before, or why did you choose this specifically now?
Well, the reason why I chose this film is because, again, I don't think it's actually been discussed that often. It's certainly not discussed in the common conversation when you bring up films starring Laurel and Hardy. It's not a film that's brought up very often. But it always intrigued me, as I heard it's this French, Italian, U.S. co-production, and another thing that's interested me is because being a relatively cheap guy sometimes that I am, I often go for the public domain DVD and VHS sets. And Utopia, which is its American title, again, the original title of the film is Atoll K. But under its American title, Utopia, it always wound up on those cheap public domain Laurel and Hardy DVD sets. And it was usually actually almost always paired up with their 1939 RKO feature, The Flying Deuces, which I will just state right now is a much more superior work to Atoll K. But it was I always saw it paired, and I was always like, okay, I think I'll finally check this movie out, and I go through my little spurts where I become interested, in reading up on, I think like yourself, on films that are very maligned and, derided and because I'm always, of the opinion that, I don't go with the common opinion. I try to give films a fair shake. I mean, actually, right now, pertaining actually to Laurel and Hardy, I'm actually making my way through their 1940s film output. The 6 films that they made at 20th Century Fox, and the 2 films that they made at MGM. You want to talk about films that are maligned? Well, there you go. A lot of, a lot of diehard Laurel and Hardy fans aren't fans of those at all, and some consider them even to be some of the worst comedies ever filmed. But I'm working my way through them to sort of make my own opinions and my own opinions about these films. And so far, it's been a pretty decent experience. I mean, the thing that you have to realize is, the Fox films, anything Laurel and Hardy, I think it's safe to say, anything Laurel and Hardy made post 1940 and post Hal Roach will never be considered a comedy classic by any stretch of the imagination. But if anything, they're pleasant time wasters. And if I'm being completely 100% honest, I mean, I'd rather see the all-time worst Laurel and Hardy film instead of the all-time best Adam Sandler film. That's just my opinion.
Right. I suppose the perceived wisdom as well is in the 40s they were kind of surpassed by Abbott and Costello. Those are the kind of the new guys in town film-wise. Seems to be what I often read is they kind of passed the torch over a little bit. They were a slightly different, slightly more contemporary feel to them, even though to I guess today's eyes, to most people they kind of look like the same thing, right? They look like old-time comedy.
Yeah. I mean, probably, in all honesty, the only thing that, the only 2 things that really Abbott and Costello are even remembered for today are their set piece, which is the Who's on First routine, which in and of itself, you could see a direct precursor to that in a 1931 Wheeler and Woolsey film, Crack Nuts, where they perform almost an exact precursor to that routine. And the only other thing that Abbott and Costello are really known for are their horror comedies. In particular, one, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was, in a weird sort of a way, a send-off and a swan song of the popular Universal monster horror films that started all the way back in 1931 with the release of the Todd Browning Dracula. But as far as Laurel and Hardy are concerned, I mean, yeah. I mean, they're films that they made for Hal Roach Studios and released through MGM. That's the one thing that people need to realize. These weren't made at MGM. They were only distributed by MGM, but they were produced under the supervision of Hal Roach, who was a comedy producer. He produced other comedy series at the time, like the Boyfriends comedy shorts with Mickey Daniels, the Taxi Boys comedies. Most famously, other than Laurel and Hardy, he produced the Our Gang short subjects, which were later repackaged into television as The Little Rascals, and of course spawned a god-awful film made in the 90s with Bug Hall as Alfalfa, which the less said about that, the better. And so, yeah, Laurel and Hardy had left Hal Roach over creative disputes because towards the end of their relationship, things got a little tense between Stan Laurel and Hal Roach, because the thing that a lot of people don't realize is Stan Laurel actually had a lot of creative input over the films that they had made at Hal Roach. He, personally himself supervised the editing, the scripts, the direction. So he definitely had an imprint on the films that they made at Hal Roach. And I guess towards the end of the decade of the 30s, Hal Roach was starting to really meddle in their productions, and that's actually what caused them to go to RKO to produce the one feature, The Flying Deuces. I mean, but they did come back to Roach to make, I think, a couple more films. They made A Chump at Oxford in 1940, which actually features a young Peter Cushing. And they also made their last film at Hal Roach was, I think, made and released around the same time, a film called Saps at Sea. But they wound up leaving Hal Roach, and they signed on shortly thereafter with 20th Century Fox. And the thing that people have derided for years about the 20th Century Fox films is that, and the MGM films, is that they didn't really understand the boy's character. And another thing is that they never really consulted at all with Stan and Laurel on the production of them. So instead of having that unique comic touch that you found in the Laurel and Hardy films, Laurel and Hardy were pretty much treated as, a generic comedy team, they like an Abbott Costello and everything. I guess another thing, a buddy of mine, James Nybar, who's an author and a film historian, he's surmised that the Laurel and Hardy comedic style of the 30s would not have translated so well into the more cynical, war-bound 1940s, where comedians like Bud Abbott and Lou Costello flourished. So I guess 20th Century Fox, wanted to have that turn Laurel and Hardy into their own versions of Abbott and Costello, instead of letting them, play their own style of comedy. And it's very telling that, in I think 1941, Universal came out with Buck Privates, a very famous wartime comedy with Abbott and Costello. And shortly thereafter, or around that same time, 20th Century Fox came out with the first of what would be 6 films with Laurel and Hardy. And that would be a film that I actually really, really enjoy. And that's 1941's Great Guns, which is a pretty decent comedy, all things considered. And so,
is that a World War I trenches film, if I remember?
Great Guns, that's actually a more or less of a World War II.
Oh, okay.
That's a common thread that you'll find in a lot of the Laurel and Hardy films in the 40s. Are, if the films aren't directly about the war, there are at least references to it. Like a film that I just watched today, Jitterbugs.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the 3rd of the 20th Century Fox films. In the beginning of the film, Stan and Ollie get lost on a desert road, and Stan actually has a gas rationing card to go get gas, and they stumble upon a gas station, but it winds up being closed for the duration because there was a major gas shortage in World War II, because they needed gas for the tanks and all that, and the military vehicles to serve the common cause. And there's actually the character in that who's Chester Wright, played by Bob Bailey, if I am remembering correctly. He actually was kind of like a snake oil salesman, and he's trying to peddle these magic gasoline pills that will turn water into gasoline, even though towards the end of the film they don't exactly have the desired effect, and the effect that they actually do have is not unlike that of the fizzy lifting drinks that Peter Ostrom and Jack Albertson consumed towards the end of the film Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And other references to the war, of course, there is the film that they made at MGM, I think around that same time, called Raid Wardens, a rather mediocre effort, but besides the point, that was another like wartime film where Laurel and Hardy have to foil a Nazi plot, and along the way they and the one thing about that film that's actually really, really nice is they get to go toe to toe again with Edgar Kennedy, who for those of you who don't know, was actually a very popular comedic character actor in the 1930s. He appeared in pretty much everybody's movies, like the Marx Brothers. Famously enough, he was the lemonade vendor in Duck Soup, and he was also the chairman of the Geneva Peace Conference and the Wheeler and Woolsey film Diplomaniacs. And he, of course, had his own series of comedies that he made at RKO, and I think he meets some at Hal Roach as well. And the sad thing is actually in Air Raid Wardens, he looks actually a little tired and a little worn down. And of course, this was at actually the twilight of his career. He wound up actually dying later in the decade in 1948. So this was really one of his last films. And I believe the last film that he made was a film with Doris Day. And the title of which escapes me, but he wound up passing away in 1948. But it was nice to see them go toe to toe again. And of course, another Laurel and Hardy film, which I haven't gotten this far in the filmography. I've only seen up to Jitterbugs thus far. But there's another film in the Laurel and Hardy filmography that actually deals with them trying to deliver a bomb. And that is the notorious The Big Noise, which I think came out in 1943, which is derided by a lot of Laurel and Hardy fans and was actually listed by Michael Medved in the 50 worst films of all time. However, the film does have its fans, and I can't wait to get to it to see, what all the fuss is about. Again, I want to give another big tip of the hat to my buddy James Nybar, who has been an avid defender of the post-Roach Laurel and Hardy films for over 50 years. So there's that. And given the film that we're going to be discussing tonight as well, I want to give a bigger tip of the hat to my buddy Chris Seguin, who is an avid fan of the film Atoll K and actually created a video essay for the most recent BFI Blu-ray presentation. So I want to give him a big tip of the hat. So I've definitely been getting back into a lot of Laurel and Hardy and been, studying up on their careers. So there's that. Now, Clive, you're actually a man of British descent, and as it's understood, Laurel and Hardy, I think actually, and I think this is due in part to the fact that during the time of the filming of these films in the 40s, they had actually gone out on tour and become like live entertainers over there in the UK. I think, I think I'm safe in saying that Laurel and Hardy actually have a bigger fan base over in the UK and Great Britain than they do possibly even here in their homeland, the United States of America. So from your vantage point as a man of British descent, did you grow up with Laurel and Hardy films? Were you ever a fan of theirs? And, were your parents fans of theirs? What's your personal experience with Laurel and Hardy?
Yeah, I'd never actually thought about it in that respect before, because I always took it for granted. But yes, Laurel and Hardy were around. They were, I can't remember a time when Laurel and Hardy weren't there, And it's interesting, you mentioned a lot of the films you mentioned, for instance, Saps at Sea, Jitterbugs, Great Guns, Champ at Oxford. I remember all of those screening fairly regularly on British TV when I was a child. So I don't know if there was some sort of package maybe that was sold to television with all a bunch of the post-Roach films. But yeah, I'm probably more familiar with that stuff than I am with the Hal Roach stuff, actually. So they certainly, I don't consider them lesser films necessarily, just because those are the ones that I grew up with, and those are the ones that that's my image of Laurel and Hardy. And then of course they showed the if you remember the animated Laurel and Hardy TV series.
Oh yeah, that the Hanna-Barbera one.
Yeah, that was on all the time when I was a kid. So yeah, no, definitely a big part of my growing up. Laurel and Hardy. I don't know about my parents necessarily, but yeah, I figured they must have been. It's odd. I don't know. I think my generation in the UK, maybe being one of the last generations that grew up with just a handful of terrestrial TV stations, before satellite and everything came along and dominated. I grew up with a lot of stuff that was much, much older than I think kids grow up with today, maybe on television. So, in the 80s, I was watching old Flash Gordon serials early in the morning, on BBC Two, really early in the morning. They'd show those just as filler, and I'm guessing
The
by
Buster Crab ones, correct?
yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Buck Rogers and King of the Rocket Men and stuff like that. And I guess by the time the 80s rolled around, that stuff probably wasn't showing in the US anymore to children, right, on terrestrial television. I'm guessing things
Right.
moved on.
Yeah. I mean, stuff like that. I mean, unfortunately, I'm only 25 years old, so I really didn't grow up in that era. But I imagine that that stuff was probably relegated to at least to probably really late at night, or like specialty showings, like the old horror hosts, for example, would host probably like an evening of Flash Gordon serials, or the odd Monogram or PRC
Right.
Poverty Row horror film, which is really something, if I'm being completely honest, is something that we really should bring back. I mean, I know on stations like Me TV, they have people like Sven Gulli. He's still at it after all these years, still hosting films, but not everybody gets Me TV. I certainly don't, and that's really unfortunate, because I would love to, tune in and watch Sven Gulli, because I've always had a fascination with the horror hosts. So yeah, I mean, really over here, I mean, speaking from, my personal experience, really the only network, and this is a whole other rant that I could go down, which I won't, bog people down with my personal thoughts on the network, but really the only place now where you can see classic films, and films of especially this vintage, is Turner Classic Movies. They're really the only network here in America that really airs this stuff. I think there's another network called Movies Network or something like that, but not everybody gets that. I mean, there was a time when they used to show classic films like on basic cable and on network television, like Citizen Kane and all that, like on a lot of people of an older generation that I'm friends with, remember on good old WOR TV out of New York and whatever, and WPIX, they used to show a lot of classic films on basic television. I mean, WOR for a while was actually an RKO Radio Pictures and RKO General owned television station, so they probably showed, I would imagine, a lot of stuff from the RKO film library. But unfortunately, nowadays you're lucky if NBC shows It's a Wonderful Life during the Christmas season. By and large, the mainstream, and this is a really, really sad fact, and I think that's why a lot of people of, especially my generation, turn their noses up at classic material, because by and large they really haven't been exposed to it, unless it's something like Wizard of Oz or something like that. Because there's just very little exposure. They don't air the stuff anymore. There's no use to air stuff in black and white anymore, because who's going to watch any of that old grimy black and white stuff? I'm right here. It's like there are still people out there, and young people like myself out there, who still enjoy this material, and there is a place for this material. And I said I wasn't going to get into a rant, but I guess a mini one will do. I'm very displeased with the current status of Turner Classic Movies, and how they've completely changed a lot of their mantra, and they're showcasing films from like the 70s now, the 80s, the 90s, even stuff from like the 2000s. Like they're showing stuff like The Hurt Locker from 2008, and I think while I feel that there certainly is a place for those films, it's not on TCM. In my honest opinion, TCM should the cutoff point should be 1960 for films to be shown on that network, and that's the way it was when it started. That network initially started because of a love affair that Ted Turner had with classic films. I mean, Gone with the Wind is the whole reason why he bought out the MGM and RKO libraries to begin with. So, I think TCM has sort of veered away from their original mission statement, and people like me personally would like to see them, sort of go back to their roots a little bit. But probably the genie's out of the bottle now, and there's not much I could do. That's why I'm grateful for the classic material that they do still continue to show. Like they're going to be showing Babyface and Employee's Entrance, and a lot of good pre-code films tonight. And I'm going to be time shifting those. Yes, I still use VHS, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, why don't you use DVD? Because I just choose not to. Thank you very much.
You asked also about Laurel and Hardy's kind of how they almost had a longer longevity here, and they came over and did their tours and stuff in the 50s. Did you happen to watch the recent film Stan and Ollie?
Oh, with John C. Reilly and Steve Coogan?
Yes.
I saw the first few minutes of that. I mean, in my honest opinion, personally, I would rather, have them cover their whole careers instead of just that latter half. Actually, I would like to see them make a movie out of the production of the film that we're going to be discussing tonight. And folks, I would like to apologize for my long rambling. It's not very often that I get to talk turkey and talk shop with people as far as classic films go. Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen of it, seeing Steve Coogan and John C. Reilly, in their Laurel and Hardy garb, walking through a facsimile of Hal Roach Studios and performing their old routines and everything else, it just brought a tear to my eye because it felt like the boys are back. The good old times are back. And quite honestly, I wish that, Hollywood would make more films like this. I mean, I think the unfortunate thing about Stan and Ollie is I don't think it received very much distribution or even that very much publicity or attention. The mainstream really just didn't pay much attention to it. And I think that's sad because Laurel and Hardy are comedy icons and they deserve to be respected and revered and appreciated. I think, Hollywood is doing a lot of the old comics and a lot of the old actors great disservice by just eschewing their legacies like that. But that's just my opinion.
It was a pretty good film actually, and John C. Reilly and Steve Coogan were uncannily reminiscent of Stan and Ollie. I have to say they did a brilliant job.
Well, from what I've seen of it, it was certainly an improvement over the horribly ill-conceived reboot that they tried to produce in the 90s, The New Adventures of Laurel and Hardy for the Love of Mommy or something like that, where they had, of all people, Gaylord Sartain from the Ernest movies as Oliver, and they had Bronson Pinchot.
Yes, this is Balky. We are so happy we do the dance of joy.
Yeah, that guy as Stan Laurel.
I never saw it. I hadn't thought about it until you brought it up now, but a small masochistic part of me almost is tempted to go and watch it now. Was it pretty bad, was it?
Well, it was produced by John Cherry, who made a lot of the Ernest movies, and while I can appreciate, the fact that he's a fan of the Laurel and Hardy films, there's something to be said about directors sticking to what they know and the types of films that they create. And I think that John Cherry certainly created a legacy and an enterprise with the Ernest films. But I think suffice it to say, Mr. Cherry should have, quote, stayed in his lane, so to speak.
Yes.
Instead of,
Ernest is a world away, really, from Laurel and Hardy, isn't it?
Correct.
So, yeah. So let's get to it then. So, how do you want to go about this? Do you wanna give us a kind of brief plot synopsis of Atoll K? I suppose.
Yeah.
Just to put this into context, because we did actually forget to mention this. So this was the last feature film that Laurel and Hardy made.
Correct.
Right. And as you mentioned, they did have this slightly extended kind of touring career in the UK and Europe, but this was kind of them towards the end, really, isn't it, in terms of their US career, certainly. And we'll get into it in more detail later in terms of running order and stuff, but there's running times and versions. But are we going to, what are you going to go with for just your base starting off point? You're going to give the plot synopsis here. Are you going from the Utopia cut or the Atoll K cut? Not that it makes a huge difference, but
well, I think just the basic synopsis will do. I don't think. I mean, we can get into the minutia later.
Right.
But I think just a basic plot synopsis. Basically, what Atoll K is about is Stan's uncle has kicked the bucket and has left him with a considerable amount of cash, which the majority of which is actually taken by creditors and bankers and such, leaving him with very little. And in addition to that, he's inherited an island and a yacht. So along the way, when they board the yacht, there's actually a stateless man, and a stateless man is a guy with no nationality. He winds up boarding with them and becoming their ship's mechanic and their chef. And so they wind up going off in search of the island. And there's also a stowaway on the boat who can't seem to get on. There's a lot of comical misunderstandings about that. Well, anyway, so Laurel and Hardy, along with these two other gentlemen, Giovanni and Antoine, are on this yacht headed for Stan's island that he's inherited. But unfortunately, there's a storm at sea, which causes their ship to wreck and causes an atoll to appear. And for those of you who don't know what an atoll is basically an island formed by coral reefs and formed from a volcanic eruption. And that's what they wound up landing on and creating their own little community. And then there's a subplot with a French chanteuse and Susie Delar. She's trying to get away from her sort of pesky fiance and make a life for herself on this island here. So they wind up all working together. And by the end there, Ali becomes the president of the island, christening it Crusoe Land in reference to Robinson Crusoe, that famous work of literature. And but then the island winds up being invaded by all these immigrants, knowing that Ali has set forth rules that there are basically no rules and no taxes, and people are pretty much free to live as they want. Pretty much straight up anarchy is what you could call it. And so a lot of things run amok there. And suffice it to say, the island implodes on itself, and Stan and Ollie wind up broken and alone as the picture fades out. But yeah, that's pretty much what Atoll K is about. It's part political satire, it's part art film, and it's part Laurel and Hardy comedy. And how all three of those things mix in with each other, okay, but
that was impressive. I think me and Ron should take a leaf out of your book there. That was very succinct. That was good. I was reminded of this film before having seen it as well a few years ago, because the atoll being born happened just off the coast of Japan 5 years ago now, maybe. A new island just suddenly popped out of the water and immediately became a small habitat, and birds started landing on it, and some guy from Australia ended up illegally landing on it. He took a boat there and of course immediately contaminated this area that they were going to research. And but because I have a strange movie addled mind, the first thing that came to mind was, oh, that's just like that Laurel and Hardy film that I've never actually seen. But yeah, so these things do happen. I was tempted to go there and start my own utopian society with. So the big thing for Laurel and Hardy specifically is no taxes, right?
Right. I mean, that's what they're trying to get away from. What the characters are trying to get away from. Giovanni, the Italian stowaway, he's trying to get away from an ungrateful existence, pretty much building walls and such. And Antoine is a stateless man, meaning he has no nationality, no country, and he's basically confined to life on a boat. Because of that, he can't get a passport. So he's trying to just find himself a place to live, and that's what he's trying to get away from. He's trying to get away from life on board. And again, Stan and Ollie are trying to get away from taxes. They can't stand taxes, and that's that. So they're all trying to get away from various different things for various different reasons.
Adriano Rimoldi as Giovanni, and Max Aloy's the French contingent, right? He's he's Antoine. It's interesting. I was wondering about this actually, whether there was anything in relation to, I mean, were Laurel and Hardy? I mean, would this have made more of an impression when the film was new? Was there some notoriety? Had they been in trouble for tax avoidance or anything like that? Or
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, the only thing that I'm aware of is that, unfortunately, I don't think that they were very careful with money. Unfortunately, I mean, the thing is both men were married, I think, multiple times, and because of that, of course, we all know the story. That runs into a lot of money. And actually, by the end of his life, Stan Laurel was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles, and I don't think that they were. At least I've never read that they were tax evaders, so I don't think we could draw any conclusions with that. I think that this was just, them or the filmmakers, in particular, French director Leo Joannanan, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, and considering that this is a French and Italian co-production, and given that I am an English speaker, I do sincerely apologize for mispronouncing anyone's name on this program tonight.
okay, it's a long tradition on the Magic Morning Wood to mispronounce people's names, so don't worry.
So yeah, this really was an idea of French director Leo Joannanan, and his I guess he had an ambition to make a political satirical art film with Laurel and Hardy. Probably not too dissimilar to a plan that Salvador Dali himself had in mind for the Marx Brothers, called Giraffes on Horseback Salad. If that's, the project that never got off the ground. In particular, there's a photograph of Harpo playing a harp, I think, with barbed wire as the strings, and I don't think that he and Dali got along too well. But anyway, yeah, so there's that. I mean, in my honest opinion, a film like this, political satire was never Laurel and Hardy's bag. Even in the wartime Fox films that they made, I don't think it was ever. I don't think that their intent was ever to satirize the government. As a matter of fact, when they made their film Raid Wardens, the Civil Defense Department actually had overseen the production of that film to make sure that they weren't making a mockery out of civil defense and all that. So there's that. There's only one instance I can recall of a decision made in poor taste on the part of Stan and Ollie, or at least the producers of the film. There is a scene in Jitterbugs where Stan Laurel rips up his gas rationing card, and apparently this action elicited groans from the movie-going public of the day, who were starving for gas and materials in general. So there was that. That was probably the one lone misstep as far as good taste goes. But other than that, yeah, political satire was never really Laurel and Hardy's bag. That was something that was more in line with comedy like Wheeler and Woolsey and the Marx Brothers and what have you.
It's interesting as well, because in terms of, I agree with you. But what's interesting about that in relation to this film, just to emphasize, after they kind of declare this land is their land, and they make a government out of the four of them and everything. Uranium deposits are discovered on the island, and this basically brings in all the carpetbaggers from all over, right? And it's kind of a microcosm of what happens, the way kind of societies develop, and how they how political machinations can take over, and how some people can take advantage, and which was what you're referring to specifically when you mentioned the satire. And yes, Laurel and Hardy were basically good time guys, right? It wasn't their bread and butter to make big political statements. But that said, for me, that stuff is actually what's most interesting about this film. So for the first, I don't know, close to let's say half the film then, the first half of the film was pretty tough going for me, because it's Laurel and Hardy not at their best, right? I would hesitate to call this film hilarious. Far from it, really. It seemed very, tired. Seemed very tired. But then when that stuff starts, when the satire comes in, even though it's not exactly subtle, and it's not particularly well written or clever, well thought out, but it's so strange to see Laurel and Hardy in the middle of that kind of thing that it's immediately much more interesting than what come before, especially when you're getting into the area of them, public executions, and it gets surprisingly dark, and you're reminded of like the French Revolution, for example, and how the cycle, the meat grinder starts and everyone gets thrown under the bus, and so it goes in an area that you certainly wouldn't expect from the first half of the film. It's just Laurel and Hardy goofing around, and it's almost business as usual, right? Except it's in beautiful foreign locales. And then it's almost as if it switches into another film in the second half, which I find quite fascinating. I mean, did you find this film funny? Do you know, did it make you laugh?
Okay, I'm going to be straight up honest with you.
Mm.
Up until actually, an hour before we started recording this, I outright hated this film.
Okay.
Like, I had a vehement distaste of this movie. I mean, and actually, it takes a lot for me to really hate a movie. It takes a lot for, especially a film of this vintage. I mean, the only other film, from, especially of this vintage and earlier that I ever really had a vehement dislike for was the Burt Wheeler solo feature, Too Many Cooks from 31. And, even today, even this morning, I tried to, have a rewatch of the film because, I will say the film does have its fans. Like, again, my buddy Chris Seguin, and there are some other people that actually favor this film over a lot of what they were doing in the 40s post Roach. So I wanted to see what other people were seeing in this film, and for the majority of my viewings, I just was not seeing it. But upon a more recent rewatch, actually I rewatched at least part of it an hour before we started recording here. I started, I mean, I'm going to say this right up front. At least this is my opinion. Atoll K will never be considered a masterpiece. So I don't think anybody will ever consider this film to be an outright masterpiece or even a particularly good film. But I found myself warming to a little bit. I mean, I do like the character of Antoine. He's a very likable, nice guy. Giovanni, on the other hand, is, to put it bluntly, an asshole. I mean, his first, I mean, it's like his first appearance, on board with Laurel and Hardy, he stowed away on their boat. So he's on their boat illegally, and he's there and he's pushing Ollie around. He's calling Ollie fat, which, if anybody knows, Oliver Hardy knows that in real life, he really detested being looked upon in that way. He's shoving Ollie around. He's yelling at him and Stan and being just an outright dick. I mean, he warms a little bit throughout the course of the film, but for me, first impressions are everything. So I really didn't care too much for his character. Antoine, I liked. I thought Antoine was a pretty good guy. But I will say, other than Laurel and Hardy, not a very strong supporting cast. I mean, I'm coming from an area where I don't know French cinema. I don't know Italian cinema very much. I mean, if I'm being completely honest, my only experience with Italian cinema is Peplum Sword and Sandal movies, if I'm being completely honest. So a lot of these actors, a lot of these stars, well, they may have been big in their home countries. I didn't know them from Adam. I mean, I guess Susie Dallaire, is a pretty big star over there in France. And, with this film, you sort of get the feeling that they were trying to push her as an international star, because there's a long stretch in this film where you almost forget that it's a Laurel and Hardy vehicle because they focus so much on her. Like there's like when they first meet her, you know, it's like at least a good 5 or 10 minutes before Laurel and Hardy show back up on screen.
Right.
I mean, Susan Dallaire is a beautiful woman, gorgeous woman, probably one of the most beautiful co-stars Laurel and Hardy ever had. And sadly enough, she died a few years back. But you know, her character was just so unappealing and uninteresting. And you know, it's like, you know, aside from Laurel and Hardy and their plight, why should we care about any of these other characters? I mean, that's you know, and then once you know the political upheaval does happen on the island, and the natives become restless. Well, I guess they're not natives, but the what you call them, the carpetbaggers, once they become restless there, none of those characters are too particularly likable. I mean, in particular, there's this one fellow who, you know, sort of like the troublemaker, the rabble rouser, who tries to overthrow Ollie and his quote unquote administration. And he's a particularly nasty piece of work. I mean, there's a rather uncomfortable scene in I guess their local restaurant that they run there in Crusoe Land, which they've dubbed it, where this guy's actually, where they actually get into a bit of a fight with this guy physically, and this guy takes a serving dish from Antoine, who's a waiter, and he actually delivers some pretty stiff shots to Ollie's head and Ollie's gut, which, considering the age of both Stan and Ollie, you know, was really uncomfortable to watch. I mean, here's the other thing, and this is why a lot of Laurel and Hardy fans deride this, and I think we should also discuss this, because I think it would be a misguided decision not to address this when discussing Atoll K, is the condition of the two leads themselves. I mean, Stan Laurel is particularly emaciated. He's very skeletal.
Yeah,
and
death warmed up, isn't he, in this movie?
He's what?
He looks like death warmed up in this movie in some parts.
Pretty much. I mean, the thing is Stan was incredibly sick during production of Atoll K. Stan had actually lost a considerable amount of weight, and I think I read somewhere that he weighed no more than 114 pounds during the production of Atoll K. So he looks positively skeletal.
He had colitis, and also they discovered a prostate ulcer at some point, because it was a very long, it was a long production, right, from 15 to 51. It got, I think it was originally supposed to be, I don't know, like a 3-month shoot or something, but it ended up, because Stan Laurel was in and out of hospital and, you know, just couldn't make it to the set. And I mean, he was a real trooper, but there's only so much you can do, right, when you're in this condition. But then ironically, he's Ollie went first, right, in 1957. Stan managed to live until 1965.
Right.
I don't think the money would have been on Stan to have outlived Ollie at the time, right? I think that probably was a surprise if you'd put a bet on it.
Right. I mean, and to couple the ailments that you disclosed, he was also suffering from dysentery, which, you know, I mean, if we're throwing around some medical terms here, but for those of you who don't know what colitis is, that's basically an inflammation of your colon, and dysentery is when you have, not to be too graphic here, but when you have massive amounts of diarrhea with blood in the stool. And I'm sure that wasn't too comfortable. And also couple that with the fact that the medical care that Stan had received in France was rather inadequate. I mean, his wife at the time, Ida, recalls that, you know, the production was supposed to only last about 12 weeks. It wound up lasting 12 months because of the numerous hospitalizations for both Stan and Ollie. So she herself had to step in and provide nursing for her husband when the nurses were absent. So she had to, you know, treat his wounds and his bandages and all that, which I'm sure wasn't a fun experience for her. you know, and then, you know, on the other side of the coin, I mean, we're talking about how skeletal and really thin and emaciated Stan is, and it's really uncomfortable, you know, especially the scenes where Stan's trying to get a bite to eat and he wants to, you know, eat, and I'm like, look at this fellow, let the dude eat already. I mean,
Right.
come on, you know, I mean, that's kind of uncomfortable to watch. But on the other side of the coin, you have Oliver Hardy, who's probably the biggest he's ever been on film. I mean, he had, I think his weight had ballooned to at least 330 pounds. I mean, that figure has fluctuated. I've heard close to 400 pounds, the 330 figure. But regardless, he was probably the biggest he'd ever been, at least on screen. And as a result of his growing girth, he had actually suffered several heart attacks during the production. He had a lot of heart problems during the production of Atoll K, and I think because of his health issues, I think that, you know, it sort of comes across on screen, because what I've noticed about Ollie in this film is he's really angry and mean and tense throughout the course of the film. He's not the happy, jolly Oliver Hardy that we're used to. He's more of a gruff and tough character, and that's really hard to watch because you're used to, you know, the kindly, you know, teddy bear that Oliver Hardy was, at least in the Roach films. But in this film, he's kind of a little bit more on the mean side, and I think a lot of that is because of the irritability probably brought on by the ailments that Oliver Hardy was enduring at the time.
Yeah.
So
I would imagine as well, knowing I don't know too much about either of them really, but I would imagine he's his own worst enemy to a certain degree as well, with his kind of lust for life and his big appetites. I would imagine, you know, being in France and Italy, I'm sure Oliver Hardy was, you know, imbibing and eating and taking advantage of the situation even more than usual, which, you know, is not good when you're that size already, right? The strain it puts on your heart. There's always a trade-off between, you know, well, you know, I'll enjoy my life, but then how long is that life going to be when your heart's, you know, pumping at that rate to keep someone that size alive and walking around, right?
ladies and gentlemen, the comments of Clive Davis are the express opinions of Clive Davis and do not necessarily represent the opinions of Geno Cuddy or anything that Geno Cuddy represents. Thank you. End of plug. Anyway, I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, I guess you could argue to that, but
I mean, because I know I'm not as big as he was, but I'm a big fellow myself, right? And you know, it's my own fault, and there is always that trade-off. You know, there is always that trade-off. How much you should worry about your health and how much you should just you know, stress as well can kill you just as quick as anything else, right? So
yeah, stress, depression, and what have you, and that adds to a lot of people wanting to,
exactly,
you know, gorge themselves. I mean, I myself, I mean, I suffer from depression, anxiety, PTSD, and all these other things. And I'm also a bigger guy. I wish I would like to be a little bit more svelte. But unfortunately, I got a big pot belly, a big beer belly, and I don't even drink. But yeah, I mean, you know, perhaps he could have taken a better care of himself. But I think, you know, he also suffered a lot of ridicule throughout his life for his weight. And you know, the cruel irony is that when he actually lost a considerable amount of weight later in his life, because after, you know, the production of Atoll K, you know, he actually lost a considerable amount of weight. There's actually photos of him, you know, where he's really, really thin. And there's the last footage that was ever shot of Stan and Ollie. Ollie, you know, is very, very svelte and very skinny and gaunt. And a lot of people, you know, ridiculed him for looking that way too. So it's like there was no happy medium for him. It's like they made fun of him when he's fat and they made fun of him when he was skinny. So, you know, it really, you know, as much as Oliver Hardy made us laugh and he, you know, he brought a lot of happiness to people's lives, you know, his own life, you know, I would imagine because of his rotund nature and or towards the end of his life, lack thereof, I'm sure, you know, he was probably emotionally a rather distressed individual. I mean, I don't really know his story too much, admittedly, but I would imagine that he was rather sad fellow internally, and that could probably lead to a lot of, you know, eating a lot and everything else. And you know, I certainly sympathize with, you know, his plight, because by all accounts, Oliver Hardy was a nice guy and a
Mm.
good guy, you know, and it's just sad the way he and Stan, you know, especially once the 40s dawned, how they really got short shifted in Hollywood, and, you know, the treatment that they got and everything. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, earlier on, I was discussing the post-Roach films that they had made at 20th Century Fox and MGM and everything. And, you know, a lot of the studio executives would always hate working with Stan Laurel because of how Stan wanted his imprint on the productions, from the scripts, the editing, the direction. And, well, you know, I got to say, in defense of the man, you know, the films in which Stan Laurel had his personal imprint on, like Sons of the Desert and what have you, pretty much all the Roach films, you know, two-reeler shorts and features and what have you, are always genuinely good. I mean, you know, there are very few films in the Roach catalog of Laurel and Hardy that, you know, are actually duds. You know, but it's like, once, you know, they didn't take Stan seriously as a creative force, you know, and when they treated him pretty much as a hired hand, that's when the quality of their films, you know, dwindled tremendously.
Mm.
And it's quite noticeable. So Stan Laurel was more right than he was wrong, and I think that, you know, Hollywood really should have given him a lot more respect and a lot more, you know, leeway creatively, you know, because, you know, just imagine the films that he could have made, you know, in the 40s, you know, if he had, you know, his way creatively, you know, just, you know, the masterpieces that could have been made. And, you know, it was pretty much a dying deal anyway with Roach, because, you know, Roach, you know, was trying to move on from making, you know, comedy films anyway, and he was trying to move into more prestige productions, even though, ironically enough, those are the films that nobody wanted to see anything like that from Hal Roach. And he wound up closing up shop very soon. I think the film that wound up killing Hal Roach Studios was a film called Who Killed, I think it was Who Killed Doc Robin, which I think is like a murder mystery made in 1944. That's the film that I think killed the studio. So there's that.
It's
So
isn't it? I think maybe what ironically worked against specifically Stan Laurel, but Laurel and Hardy, in regards to you know, getting to write their own meal ticket, is the fact that they were so popular and they appealed to everyone. They didn't have that same kind of cachet that, for instance, Charlie Chaplin had, where he was considered a kind of auteur, right? And he got to write and direct and create his own stuff. And Stan Laurel, who, if I remember correctly, went over to Hollywood in the first place, it was something to do with Chaplin, right? It wasn't he part of his repertoire company or something?
yeah. Laurel and Chaplin were both part of I think it was the Sam Carno
Right,
troupe
right,
of
yeah.
performers over there in England. Yes.
So it seems as if Stan Laurel certainly could have raised to those heights, I think, to have whether with or without Stan, could have, you know, written his own kind of meal ticket and had the kind of auteur tag. But I think maybe, I'm not sure, but possibly the kind of populist appeal that he ended up having as part of Laurel and Hardy might have worked against him creatively in the long run, because people just wanted more of that. Like you said, I mean, you know, when poor Oliver Hardy manages to lose all that weight, you know, everyone's like, oh, where's the funny fat man gone? We want the funny fat man, right? It's feeding that meat grinder is hard work, right? To keep everyone pleased when you've got a hit on your hands. You got to keep feeding that monster, or you're going to be left behind.
Yeah, I mean, you do raise a good point there. I mean, Stan Laurel was a creative genius, and I think he's one of the unsung comedy geniuses of his time, as far as the material that he himself created, for not only his earlier silent solo career, but also the work that he did as part of Laurel and Hardy. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, unfortunately, when you become popular, you get sort of pigeonholed into one specific type of entertainment that you provide. I mean, probably one of the more famous examples of that is Baylor Lugosi. I mean, after the wild success of Dracula, all they wanted to do was put him in horror films. They didn't let him, stretch his creative and artistic legs as an actor and put him in like comedies and romantic dramas and stuff like that. He was pretty much a horror guy. I mean, even in a film like 1939's The Gorilla with the Ritz Brothers, which is a comedy, it's still like a horror comedy. So he never really got away from the horror aspect of films. And sadly enough, as the years went on, him and those ghastly Ed Wood films. Yeah, I mean, again, yes, I mean, as far as Stan Laurel goes, I mean, yeah, I mean, he was not only a creative genius and a comedy icon, but like when you watch Raid Wardens, I mean, yeah, it is an inferior work to what they did at Hal Roach, but it proves that he was a very competent actor too, in his own right. I mean, there's a really heart-wrenching scene where Stan and Ollie are disbarred from the air raid squadron, and Stan actually gives a pretty heart-wrenching speech to who are now his former comrades, and it's real. And I was really taken aback by that, because I wasn't expecting a really serious and somber performance from Stan Laurel in that regard. And just seeing that alone, makes me think of what kind of films we could have gotten from them, how their comedy, if they weren't so meddled by the studios, what kind of comedy they could have made, and how their comedy would have evolved over time, and and it's of my honest opinion, especially when you consider their MGM output, and I think a lot of other people share this opinion as well. MGM is pretty much the studio where comedians' careers went to die. I mean, going to MGM, if you're a comedian, going to MGM in the 30s and 40s, it's pretty much career suicide. I mean, just looking at like Buster Keaton, for example, and those atrocious talkies that he made at MGM with Jimmy Durante and such, and then the later Marx Brothers films where they crowbarred in these obnoxious and rather unlikable and bland romantic couples into the antics of the Marxes. And then of course you get these two Laurel and Hardy films, Raid Wardens and Nothing But Trouble, which in and of itself I think is quite hilarious, how there are two comedies called Nothing But Trouble, and they're both really horrible. And of course the other one that I'm referring to is the Dan Aykroyd John Candy atrocity.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, again, MGM is the studio where good comedians went to essentially bury their careers. Sad to say, which is ironic considering that they released some of the best Hal Roach films. But again, they only released those; they didn't produce them themselves.
Right, right. They didn't have the touch. So, as we previously mentioned, you can now see Atoll K in a lovely restored Blu-ray that runs 98 minutes, which, as far as I can tell, is pretty much as much as it had ever ran. Right, I think they've pretty much tracked down almost everything in terms of footage. But as you mentioned, Geno, it did end up in the US, at least, in its 82-minute cut, Utopia, as part of the public domain. So a lot of people did end up seeing this film, but in very kind of poor condition, I guess. So as well as this shortened version, which I mean, that's 16 whole minutes missing, right? But I have to say, as an experiment, I watched the Atoll K version, and then normally what I would do in this case, I'd watch them side by side, and I'd make a note of what was missing and what wasn't. But in this case, I wanted to kind of watch it and to see if I would notice what was missing. And I have to say, even though 16 minutes sounds like a lot, it's very difficult unless you do go through them side by side. It's very difficult to actually tell what's missing from the Utopia cut because it's little bits from here and there, you know. It's Susie Delaire only performing one song rather than two, or scenes are shortened ever so slightly. And I don't think there's any major one particular chunk or one huge important scene in its entirety that's removed from the Atoll K version to the Utopia version.
Right. I mean, I do have the Italian version, which is titled Atoll K. And apparently in the Italian version, because again, this was a French-Italian co-production, apparently in the Italian version, Giovanni actually has a more of an extended sequence where he goes into a little bit more of his background. I guess the French version has some more stuff with Antoine or Susie Delaire. I guess, because you have, besides Stan and Ollie, you have, a French actor as a supporting lead, and you also have an Italian actor as a supporting lead. I would imagine, without having seen the other cuts of the films, that the French cut, with Antoine and Susie Delaire, would cater more to a French audience, with more of them. And I guess, the Italian cut with more of Giovanni would cater more to an Italian audience.
From what I could tell, the French version certainly retained more stuff of Delaire and Max Eloy, but I don't think there was anything additional. The Italian version, like you said, Giovanni does have an additional flashback, but it only runs about a minute, and it's basically when he's explaining about how he built this wall and it was torn down and replaced by a fence. You actually get a flashback of him having just built a wall and the guy who commissioned him turning up and saying, "Tear down the wall." And I mean, there's very little to it. Actually, that's the only additional footage that I don't think is in the otherwise full-length version. But like I said, I earlier before we started recording, I did kind of skim the French and Italian versions rather than sit down and watch them end to end, because I had watched this film twice by then. So, in a very short period of time. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must give Mr. Davis a round of applause. I mean, the thing is this guy is a masochist for sitting through like 4 or 5 different versions of the same film, and a film that's not even really particularly good. So we must give this man some praise. Well,
kindly shared by your good self as well, Geno. I should mention that.
I mean, what I'd be interested in saying is. Atoll K, the version that's been released on the BFI Blu-ray, is actually the original English cut that was screened for premiere audiences, I think, in '51. But the version that I'd like to see is the second British cut, which had more of a wide release, and that was under the title Robinson Crusoe Land. But I would like to say, apparently that edit is actually closer in tone to the Utopia US cut, with just some more choppy editing. That's what I've heard about it, but I'd still like to see it nonetheless. I like seeing different versions of the same film just to compare them all.
Yeah, I mean,
but yeah, the ironic thing about at least the Utopia Atoll K, the really interesting thing is Stan Laurel, when all was said and done, he hated this movie, and he hoped it would never get released. He hoped nobody would ever see it. But the fickle finger of fate here, determined that Utopia goes public domain and therefore becomes one of the most widely seen of the Laurel and Hardy films.
Right.
So there's that. And I guess since, we have disclosed, that this was a French-Italian co-production, just some of the production difficulties associated with a film of this nature. I mean, and if I may remark before I discuss this, I think it's kind of ironic that Laurel and Hardy's sound film career, they started out making films in multiple languages. Like, a lot of their Hal Roach short films were actually back in the days of the early sound. They actually created more expanded versions. Like they would film like the same short, like Blotto, for instance, from 31. They actually filmed that like 3 times, like once in its English cut, and then they would film it in French for the French market and Spanish for the Spanish market. And sometimes like the Spanish cuts would be more interesting because they would be longer and they would have, at least in the pre-code films, a lot more saucy material.
Their own phonetic line readings as well, didn't they? It wasn't dubbed.
Right, Laurel and Hardy, spoke their lines phonetically. That's correct. Not too dissimilar to what they did with Dracula, how they had the Todd Browning, Bela Lugosi Dracula, and then they had, of course, the Spanish language version with, I believe the fellow's name was Carlos Villarreal as Dracula in the Spanish cut, which a lot of people consider to be the superior cut.
Yes.
And so I consider ironic that they started their and ended their sound filmmaking career with films in multiple languages. I guess that just proves that Laurel and Hardy's comedy is universal in that regard. Yeah. And so anyway, getting into the fact that this was a French-Italian co-production, the difficulties, surrounding that, even taking out the health aspect of the 2 leads, is the fact that Laurel and Hardy were pretty much the only people on set who spoke any English. Like nobody else, spoke English. So it's like my buddy Chris Seguin, who I've mentioned throughout the interim of this program, has actually, he uploaded to Facebook kind of a unique look at what Atoll K actually was. Pardon me. He posted the opening scene where Laurel and Hardy are meeting with the executors of Stan's uncle's estate. And, you see them all speaking in their native French or in Italian. And then you have Laurel and Hardy speaking in English. And that's pretty much what it was like on set, which is why it's actually quite amazing that the film is as good as it is, given the fact that nobody understood what anybody else was saying. Like, Aloy, and again, I'm forgetting the Italian fellow's name.
Adriano Grimaldi.
Grimaldi, yeah. Aloy and Grimaldi. It's amazing, the fact that how they're able to react to what Laurel and Hardy are saying, even though they don't really know the language. There is a language barrier there, so that's pretty amazing. And same with Susie Dallaire later. So that's it's pretty interesting to watch from that aspect of it.
To be fair as well, it's worth pointing out that even though I don't think this film is funny at all, I never got the sense that these people don't understand what they're saying and therefore the comic timing is fucked up. That wasn't what I thought the problem was. You know what I mean? I just thought this just isn't fun. This would be equally unfunny if everyone was speaking the same language. Or my instincts didn't tell me that was the problem. Now that could have been the problem, but it doesn't necessarily play that way. Do you think?
Right. I mean, the thing that I have to say about that, and at least from what we see, in front of the camera as far as the actors. I mean, again, I liked Antoine. I thought he was a good character. I thought he was a good guy, and I think Max Aloy, played that character pretty well. But I will say that nobody will ever replace that Hal Roach stock crew of character actors. Like half the fun in watching a Laurel and Hardy comedy is seeing how the other characters in them react to what Laurel and Hardy are doing.
Right.
Like the tit for tat stuff that they do. Like how James Finlayson, for example, would react to what Laurel and Hardy do with that famous, double take and that look into the camera and that dough expression and, just his wonderfully expressive, face and everything. And of course, Charlie Hall with his angry, bitter mugging to the camera as well, and Mae Bush and Thelma Todd and all the wonderful, again, stock players at Hal Roach that they didn't have, as their careers progressed, and again, Fox and MGM and what have you. That's what their later films really lack, and I think that's why a lot of the gags. I mean, there's still some great gags. I mean, again, I consider Great Guns to be a really good film. And I like the scene where Stan shoves his pet bird into Ollie's pants while they're standing at attention in a line of cavalrymen. But I think a lot of what the later films are lacking, and why a lot of the jokes don't land is because they don't have those wonderful, stock players, to react to the material. Because again, as I said, half the fun in seeing what Stan and Ollie, what hijinks they get into is seeing, the way people in those films react to, their mishaps and their bumbling and fumbling. And unfortunately, that's why, Atoll K suffers from that same syndrome that their Fox and MGM films suffer from, is the fact that they don't have character actors like that. I mean, again, the closest that they ever got to it was Edgar Kennedy in Raid Wardens. But in Atoll K, we don't even have anybody like of that caliber. So that's why I don't think a lot of the jokes land too. And again, we must take into consideration that Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel are considerably older, and seeing them do a lot of these physical routines is kind of an uncomfortable watch, considering the ages of these two gentlemen, and especially given the rather frail condition of Stan Laurel. Seeing him do a lot of pratfalls and stuff is kind of uncomfortable. But
yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, actually, Geno. This film would definitely have benefited from a James Finlayson, for example. There's definitely a glaring hole, which I hadn't identified, I have to admit, but I think you're onto something there. So while I was researching this film, I discovered that there's an entire book about it called The Final Film of Laurel and Hardy, a study of the chaotic making and marketing of Atoll K by one Norbert Aping. So I actually went ahead and read this book in preparation. I couldn't order a physical copy in time, unfortunately, so I had to pay way too much for a Kindle copy. Have you read this book by any chance, Geno?
No, and I'm actually surprised that you went to that extent, and I praise you for doing that. And I look forward to hearing your findings. So the floor is yours at this point, Clive.
Well, it seems churlish of me to criticize the book, because it's exactly what it is, right? And I suspect if you were a bigger Laurel and Hardy film a fan than I am, or a fan of the film in particular, I don't suppose you could begrudge it anything, because it does pretty much go into huge amounts of detail about the entire production from soup to nuts, right? And for me, as someone, I was hoping, I suppose, sometimes a monograph on a particular film, regardless of whether the film's any good or not, it can speak to larger themes or something, right? You might not necessarily think that whatever is sometimes a really amazing film, someone writes a whole book about it and it's dull as dishwater, but then someone writes a book about a smaller film and somehow all of life is there, right? It can be found there. So I was hoping this might be along those lines, but it's not. I mean, if you're interested in Atoll K, this is the book for you, but it's not one of those film books that I think is going to appeal to a casual reader who's going to get more out of it. I learned a few interesting bits and pieces, like how they brought in Alfred Golding, who'd been a seasoned Laurel and Hardy director, to try and help with some of it.
Oh yes, and yeah, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the contributions of Mr. Golding and particularly Monty Collins, who was a great comedy actor and gag man in his own right. They particularly brought them over to the production of this film to spice up the rather lackluster script that Leo Johannan had created initially, and as was the norm for their later, productions, Laurel didn't see eye to eye creatively with Johannan, so they wound up actually, and this is the most interesting part, they wound up bringing in a blacklisted director in John Barry to direct a lot of the film. And for people who don't know what blacklisting is, let me briefly explain what that is. Blacklisting was practiced back in the 50s, 40s and 50s. It came to pass that there were a lot of people in Hollywood who are actually communists, and there was a whole organization built around that, the House of Un-American Activities and all that, and a lot of people are outed. Edward Dmytryk, who was a communist himself, later outed John Barry, and because of that, Barry had to exile overseas, and that's probably how he got work on Atoll K, is because he was probably just in town, and they wound up getting him to punch up the lackluster material that Johannan had directed. I mean, from the recollections of Ida Laurel, who was Stan's wife at the time, she said that Johannan was really a hack director, and he considered himself, and he had a bigger impression of himself than he actually was. I think she recalled that he spent like 5 days or something photographing a lake because it was the most photogenic lake he had ever seen. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. That whole thing is fascinating. How a lot of blacklisted creatives of all type ended up in Europe, just because, I mean, obviously there was a lot less paranoia around suspected communism in Europe than the United States at the time, or rather, I don't know, the concepts weren't as scary or as alien somehow than they were in the political climate of United States at that time. So they found themselves able to work. Yeah, like you said, they couldn't get they wouldn't be able to get arrested back at home, right?
Right.
The other thing reading the book pointed out to me, which I otherwise might
also,
yeah,
before you delve into that, I just wanted to briefly touch upon the interesting correlation there, that a blacklisted director was outed as a communist is basically working in France on a Laurel and Hardy political satire, and that's probably part of the reason why the film didn't gain much traction when it was finally exported to America in 1954 under the name of Utopia, distributed by the wonderfully named and aptly named Exploitation Producers Limited, as part of a double bill with the crime drama The Blackboard Jungle. Even when it was exported here to America, it didn't do so well either. It didn't do well in its homeland, and it didn't do too well here in America either. And it was pretty much swept under the rug shortly thereafter. So
one of the arguments that the book makes, though, is that if you look at its larger worldwide release, it kind of did a lot better than you might expect. For instance, in Poland, apparently, where Laurel and Hardy are known as Flip a Flap, which I didn't know, and I think Germany as well, it did surprisingly well. It had quite a long theatrical life there, certainly more so than in the United States.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Again, as I stated, Laurel and Hardy have universal appeal, and in Poland they're known as Flip a Flap, and Germany they're known as Dick and Doof,
Right.
and then Mexico is probably the most insulting of the brandings, considering how Oliver Hardy felt personally. In Mexico, Laurel and Hardy were known as El Gordo y El Flaco, which pretty much means the fat and the thin, which again, considering that Oliver Hardy didn't like everybody referred to as fat, is kind of in poor taste, if I may add, but that's that.
The Spanish release title for the film is my favorite actually. In Spain, it was called Robinsons Atomicos, which I quite like. I guess the atomic Robinson Crusoe land, I suppose. I found that amusing, but then again, I'm a bit of an idiot. The other thing that the book pointed out, which I wouldn't have noticed otherwise, was there's an insert shot in the American version when they're drinking wine, when Antoine is preparing a meal for them and their bits of food and drink go missing, they're drinking wine, right? And apparently there's an insert shot in the American one of a bottle of Welch's grape juice, which
yes, yes, there is, yes.
And that's not in the Utopia version. That was specifically for the American market.
You mean that's not in the Atoll K
British
version?
Yeah.
Well, that Clive, I'm sorry to say that was probably just a simple matter of product placement. I mean, if you look at the last film that the Marx Brothers made, for example, the finale of that film is basically product placement palooza with Harpo, walking into I think a cigarette company advertisement. So, that certainly was an uncommon practice, but it's pretty sad considering, what superstars these guys were just a few decades earlier,
Well,
they have to resort to putting product placement in the film in order to have it sell, to make a buck, pretty much.
But I suppose it's a practice that's only grown, right, over the years.
Yes.
The best thing about like I said, this book is recommended for only hardcore fans who already like this film and no one else read it. The best thing about it, for me at least, was it has these photographs in it of when the film was released in the UK. As part of the publicity, they created these huge life-size paper mache heads of Laurel and Hardy, and there's these great photos of these huge Laurel and Hardy heads going down the middle of the street like a parade while people stand around to deploy. It's a very surreal sight, and those photos are the best part of the book for me. I really enjoyed seeing them. Other than that, I suppose I just wanted to reiterate. So I guess we're getting to conclusion time. As I said, I found the latter half of the film interesting, but objectively interesting more than subjectively interesting. So, because as political satire goes, it's surprising more than it is well done. I mean, the thing is, when the island gets taken over and all these people come in, it's not as if you have a great deal of sympathy for Laurel Hardy and the others, right? Because their form of government is fairly idiotic, right? I mean, it's just waiting for someone to come and exploit it. It's not as if
again, it's anarchy. I mean, if you want, I guess if you look at it from this vantage point, it actually does a pretty good job of showing you what could happen if you don't have government, if you don't have laws set in place, and what happens if you do have anarchy. And I think, actually, I think, you might have touched upon something there that not even I would have thought of, is that, I guess at the end when the atoll Crusoe land winds up being submerged back into water and, it implodes upon itself, I guess that's some actually quite good symbolism of what can happen, when, a society is an anarchy. Society will implode upon itself like the land that they live on, Right. So I guess in that latter half of the film, I think it actually works well in that regard. But sadly enough for me, sort of comes a little too late because of just the monotony and the tedium of the first couple reels of film. You know?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just more interesting, like I said, objectively, that it goes there at all rather than it's well done. And the ending as well, when the island sinks. I mean, you don't even necessarily even have to take it about any specific political viewpoint. I suppose you could just look at it as existential as well, right? It's just, once again, humanity fucks it up. Like, you have a fresh start and takes us no time at all to fuck it up. You know, you could take it on that level as well if you didn't want to subscribe to any specific political reading of it. But I just thought it's a shame in a way that it's not as if when they arrived that you know, Laurel and Hardy and the others, they've formed some kind of fantastic utopian, some kind of agrarian society, and everyone shares everything and it works. And then these people come and fuck it up. It's like, from the beginning, when there's that argument in the bar where I can't remember, it's either Stan Laurel or Oliver Hardy is telling the person who's trying to buy something, "Oh, just take it. Oh, just take it. It's free. You can have it." And you're thinking, yeah, this isn't a very sustainable business model, is it? I mean, so
Right.
it's difficult to have sympathy when the more villainous characters come in, because, I mean, you know, what did you fucking expect, right?
That's true. That is true. I mean, again, this film, it's not well done. I mean, you know, there are parts of it that are well shot. Like there's it's actually really well done as far as cinematography goes. You know, on a pure cinematic, you know, cinematographic level, it's really well done. But you know, as a film, as a story, it's like, it's pretty much dead on arrival.
Yeah.
The
effects work and the general production design, I have no problem. It's all,
I mean, the only thing that really, you know, besides the Susie Dallaire subplot, one of the more unfortunate scenes is the scene where they're all trying to get into bed and a bat flies into their bedroom, and it's quite obvious that these bats are utterly fake. I mean,
True.
you know, the cynic in me would like to think that, you know, they probably borrowed, you know, these bats from Producers Releasing Corporation from their production of The Devil Bat with Bela Lugosi.
Right.
You know, I mean, I mean, these bats look utterly fake and dismal. You know, considering I think that this film was actually rather expensive to produce. You know, and you wonder where in the blue blazes did this money go. No doubt, it probably went into Laurel and Hardy's coffers, but that's besides the point.
Maybe,
but you know, it's like, but I will say, as far as that scene goes, you know, for some reason, it sort of put me in mind of a similar scene in the much later John Hughes production, The Great Outdoors, with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd, where there's a not too dissimilar scene of them fighting against a rather fake-looking bat. You know,
I haven't seen.
I wonder if John Hughes, you know, somehow, like, late night on television saw Utopia on TV and was like, you know what, I should put that in a movie. You know?
Yeah, so do you think maybe Antoine, before going on board the ship, do you think he got a dab of perfume from Bela Lugosi and then the devil backtracked him to the
probably. I you know, and that's another thing that's kind of curious to me is, you know, plot holes abound in this film, but you know, that's the other thing that's curious to me is, you know, they build up Antoine as this great chef and everything, but yet he's lived on a boat practically his entire life because he's never been able to land anywhere. So where has he gained this extraordinary culinary experience from? You know, that's you know, but.
The last bit of just minutiae trivia nerdy stuff that I wanted to mention, because I just thought it was kind of interesting as well, was apparently very early on in the days of, like, we're talking late 70s, according to the book I read, a videotape appeared seemingly out of nowhere, which was labeled Laurel and Hardy Outtakes. And apparently this was stuff that had been cut from the Utopia US version that was in Atoll K, and with some scenes from Utopia as well, just appeared at random on on video, whatever video shelves looked like in the late 70s. I can't imagine there would have been much. It must have been stuff sold through mail order or stuff like. But apparently, once upon a time, there was this item doing the rounds called Laurel and Hardy Outtakes, and it was basically stuff from Utopia. So in general, I think I'm slightly more favorable towards this film than you are, which is not what I expected, I have to admit. I expected you to be a greater defender of this film, especially since, as you said, and admirably as well, I agree with you, you make up your own decision, right? You wait and you watch it and then you decide. So it's, you're not running with a pack of all the people who have just dumped on it in the past. But through your own conclusions, you've pretty much, through your own investigations, you've kind of reached the same conclusion though, right? You're not a big fan of this film.
Well, no, I mean, it's not a film that I would choose to watch every day. I mean, coming from a guy like me, it's kind of ironic that I would even say something like that, considering, that I'm a massive fan of a film that had similar troubled experiences during its making. And I am referring to the 1932 Worldwide Pictures production of Max Sennett's Hypnotized with Miranda and Mack, that had, again, similar production problems. And is a film that's not very widely regarded as a classic, shall we say. Whereas I love Hypnotized, and I think it's actually quite good, especially in its early circus half. I just, I guess the thing that bothers me the most about Atoll K is the fact that I know Laurel and Hardy can be funny. I know that if the material is there, they could rise above mediocrity and they could put in a really good performance. But looking at them and considering the health issues that they both faced, their performances are relatively sad to look at, and because of that, it sort of and just from the way they look, that sort of takes my enjoyment out of the film. And also, because this is essentially a foreign film, and the English film is, unless Laurel and Hardy are speaking, it's primarily dubbed, and atrociously so, I might add. I wish I knew who dubbed this thing. It's probably the same people who dubbed Manos, the Hands of Fate. It's that bad. So the dubbing takes me out of the film because, I'm not used to seeing a dubbed Laurel and Hardy film. It's just not, something you see. So I guess in that aspect, this is kind of a unique little curio. But, this is a film that I want to like because it is essentially their send-off. I mean, I do like how the film ends with, spoiler alert, Laurel and Hardy eventually make it to their island, that they were going to in the first place, but they wind up losing it due to non-payment of inheritance taxes. But I like how the film ends with Ollie turning to Stan, and after finding out, that they've lost control of the island, Ollie says to Stan, "Well, here's another nice mess that you've gotten me into."
Right.
And then Stan Laurel goes into his crying jag and goes into his crying jag as the film frame sort of zooms out, out of frame. And I thought that, in that aspect, that was actually quite poetically well done. I mean, I don't know if at the time they knew that this was going to be their final feature and their swan song.
Right.
But I think, honestly, as far as a moment to go out on, what better moment to go on than that,
Yes, I agree with you. I'm glad you brought it up because I forgot about it. And the same thought occurred to me, actually. Whereas it could have just seemed like a lot of the rest of the film, it could have just seemed like them, trotting out old material or whatever. Something about it did seem like expertly timed, in the same way as, rather than a aging rock band just playing the same old songs forever, they do produce new material, but for the encore they play the the big hit that everyone knows and everyone goes nuts. It was quite well judged in that way, I thought. I agree with you. And again, it is worth wondering. Yes, you're quite right. Maybe it wouldn't have played like that in 1951. Maybe it would have just been a groan-inducing. Really, is that what they don't have any new material? But now, in retrospect, certainly it seems almost like you said, that's the word, poetic almost. It's like, what a perfect way to kind of, the rest of it might be questionable, but that's a nice little note to go out on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ending is really, really well done. It's probably the most well done aspect of the entire film. Is that scene where they're sitting surrounded by the barrels, and Ollie's looking upset, and he looks at Stan and says, well, here's another nice mess that you've gotten me into. And Stan goes into that crying jag as the camera zooms out and the frame zooms out, and the picture decreases in size, and then it brings out the end title card.
Right.
I thought that is actually kind of an emotionally beautiful chapter to a legendary screen career. I don't know again if they intended on that being, if they intended on this film being their last. I know that Laurel was working on Laurel and Hardy scripts as late as the early '60s, long after Babe had died. I thought, what a beautifully poignant way to close out their last film. It's it's like in wrestling terms, it would be known as sending the fans home happy, so to speak.
Right. Yes, it put me in mind as well. It's like, if you forget the last 4 films that he made in Mexico, if you'd rather think of Boris Karloff's last kind of really big screen moment is just slapping that sniper across the face in Targets, at the end of Targets. I don't know if you've ever seen Targets, Geno. And it's just a beautiful kind of this giant of horror, kind of realizing that the kind of horror that he used to bring to the screen has now been usurped by this much more horrible kind of
dastardly,
ungentlemanly kind of real life kind of psychotic nastiness born of not taking responsibility. And he just slaps him, doesn't he? He doesn't even punch him, or he just gives him a few slaps across the face. And that's kind of like how I like to think of the end of Boris Karloff. That's a nice way for him to go out on.
Yeah, I mean, I just consider it beautiful that they went out on Oliver Hardy. Really the last line of Atoll K. The last line of the last film of Laurel and Hardy is Oliver Hardy turning to Stan and uttering his famous catchphrase, "Here's another nice mess you've gotten me into." Now, that's the important thing I'd like to stress. People may be hearing me stress the word nice. That's the actual line. Now, people throughout time have misquoted Oliver Hardy by saying, "Here's another fine mess." Right. No, the line is actually, "Here's another nice mess you've gotten me into." Another Fine Mess is the title of their 1932 reeler, but Oliver Hardy always said nice mess. Right. I just wanted to clarify that.
Right. So there we go. This podcast is another nice mess you've gotten me into, Geno.
Well, I don't get it. Come on, Clive, you're always playing with me. What are we going to do?
play another one now. Shut up!